By the way, if you hear any weird noises throughout this video, it is just my dog behind me on the floor snoring, because apparently I bore him. Actually, I just have a really comfortable rug. So one reason I'm making this video is for education purposes, because it did take me 2 years to actually be diagnosed with having pulmonary embolisms, which is just the fancy schmancy way of saying that I have blood clots in my lungs. Ultimately, I just want people to be aware that these conditions do exist, and hopefully it will help someone in the sense that maybe they'll recognize these symptoms, or if it's similar to something that they're going through, hopefully they'll feel less alone. So I've included a handy dandy timeline for your reference, which I've also aligned with a timeline of Australian Prime Ministers. Today's tale starts in 2015, which is when I first started officially teaching secondary level students. Prior to that, I'd privately tutored and also taught university level, and culminates toward the end of 2016 in about probably October. So about 4 years ago now, I started getting really out of breath, which really didn't make sense at the time, because if anything, I was actually actively working on improving my fitness. I'd started going to the gym and working with a personal trainer, but over time I just increasingly got out of breath more and more easily. Around the same time, I started getting pains in the right side of my chest, and it turned out that my right lung had partially collapsed. It wasn't severe enough that I needed hospital treatment or anything like that. It was going to resolve on its own eventually. But it really did hurt quite a lot. And then it happened again. It happened again 3 times. It resulted in me playing way less guitar, which is really sad because that's something I really enjoy doing. Not just because it hurt, but I was actually worried that maybe I'm rocking out too hard and causing my right lung to collapse.
What music are you into? I like this. It's very grown up.
Because I like to rock like a large pebble. I also started getting sick pretty much all the time, particularly with things like bronchitis and pneumonia. And my breathlessness was just getting worse and worse. I couldn't walk 20 meters without mouth breathing really obnoxiously, which was fine with people I knew, so we could have a bit of a joke around about that sort of thing. But overall, it actually was really embarrassing. I was really surprised how much you can offend people just by breathing too loudly in their presence, particularly with people I didn't know, and being out of breath I couldn't explain either. Not that I should have had to have explained, but I really did kind of feel the need to a lot of the time.
Mouth breather.
Obviously by that point I'd started seeing a proper respiratory specialist to try and get to the bottom of things, but basically any scan we did, any test, always turned out nothing. I even had a bronchoscopy, which for my lab buddies is effectively being lavaged. My respiratory specialist and I had kind of talked about going back to square one, retesting everything, seeing if this time we could turn something up. So I was going to see my respiratory specialist in a clinic he'd started practicing in, ironically on top of a hill for a respiratory specialist, and I couldn't find any parking at the top of the hill. I had to park down the bottom of the hill, make my way up, etc. And by the time I got to reception and the waiting room, I was pretty much blue, I was panting, I was dripping with sweat. And while I'd explained my symptoms to my respiratory specialist, it was a lot more alarming to see them firsthand. And he checked me over and immediately kind of said, "You need to go to emergency right now." To which I replied, no, I'm going to go home and write the Year 9 science exam, go see a movie. I think my friend and I were seeing Doctor Strange. I think because for me at that point, it was just a normal day that I'd been experiencing those kinds of symptoms for years. So our compromise was I was going to go home, he was going to call his main hospital he practices at in advance, and they would know I was coming. I would get some clean clothes, have someone drive me to emergency, and then take things from there. And so for the first time we did a CT scan, which we had done before, but this time we did it with contrast dye, which makes it feel like you've just wet yourself, but you haven't. So they did this scan and found that I had not only a huge pulmonary embolism or a blood clot in my lung, that I actually had many. And they had to outright tell me, we only really see your condition in autopsies. So they immediately put me on anticoagulants, which are blood thinners. They brought me into ICU and instructed me to move as little as possible, and that it was quite possible I wasn't going to make it through the night. I did though. Because my case was so unusual, there would be mornings where I'd wake up at like 7 a.m. and the end of my bed would just be surrounded by student doctors and interns, and they were given the task of asking me questions and trying to diagnose me, which they invariably couldn't. Just to give you a rundown, risk factors for developing pulmonary embolism or blood clots in the lungs include smoking, only out my ears when I'm angry, recent pregnancy, no, being overweight, which was not a problem until all my health problems occurred, an active lifestyle, nope, injuries or recent surgeries, at that point, nah. And then they would show them the scan, and you'd just watch their faces go, which was very funny for me. Another bonus was that I got to come off prednisolone, and finally, 2 years later, the side effects have nearly all worn off now. I have a chin again. I think the delay in getting a diagnosis was mostly because we were so focused on the lung tissue itself. And actually, a few months before my diagnosis, I'd booked a trip to Italy way in advance, hoping to be better by the time it rolled round, but I wasn't. So I went anyway, which was really hard because Italy has a lot of cliffs and hills and stairs, but in addition to that, you really shouldn't fly with a pulmonary embolism. In fact, that's one way that they can develop in the first place. So never do this. I mean, go to Italy, but don't fly if you have blood clots in your lungs. I think I'll leave this video here for now, and next time talk a bit about my treatment from that point and the 2 years leading up to my major operation at the end of last year. Until next time, stay awesome!